Mark here with a quick insider look at how I build out a talk. And the example I'm going to use today is this talk. Serverless 308, Securing Serverless Applications Step by Step. It's one of the two talks I'm going to give at this year's AWS reInvent. Now, session seating is already open for these talks. The reservation system opened up yesterday. This talk's already full up, which is amazing. Thank you very much. There's a wait list, so please, if you're interested in what you see, sign up for the wait list because they're going to expand rooms very, very shortly, so you should be able to get a seat and come to see this talk live. But I thought it'd be interesting for you to see how I pull one of these together. So it's a 60-minute breakout, like all breakout sessions at AWS reInvent. And that means I've got 60 minutes to teach you something, but also I have 60 minutes where I have to be engaging and to keep the audience moving along with me. So that means I need some sort of story, narrative, or hook. A lot of people make the mistake when they're giving a technical talk, especially a long technical talk, they sort of set it up and do one uniform thing. So they'll start with an idea, and they'll say, you're starting here, and I want to get you to here. And they'll just come through and boom, drone, here you go, technical information, more and more detail, configuration, blah, 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 here you go. It may do the job of conveying the information, but will it keep an audience's attention for a full 60 minutes? And that's the real question. So what you actually have to do is you have to have a variety of bit of emotion. You got to make sure that you're building people through, and there's some variance here so that they still start in the same place and end at the same place, but hopefully you're building throughout the talk to end on a really, really high note. Now, it may seem weird to try to talk about a story when you're delivering a technical talk, but that's absolutely critical to delivery. With this talk, it's pretty straightforward. We're talking about how to secure a serverless application step by step. So I can give that to you by helping you build an application. So the idea here is to introduce an application to the audience and walk through it with each story, or with each step. But to do it in a manner where the audience is invested in that journey. So make sure that the application example is something somewhat relevant, somewhat relatable, and then keep tying things back to that. Don't just say, flip this switch to enable encryption, done. Flip this switch because your users are trusting you with their health information and you're trying to make it an application that makes it easier for them to use medical services or something along those lines, right? So now here at a 300 level talk at an AWS event means that there's already a baseline of knowledge. So I don't have to explain what serverless is, but I do have to define what security is for serverless applications, because if you've been following this space at all, especially the keynote that I gave last week at Serverless Conference in New York, this blows away all of the current way of how we deploy security in the cloud and around applications. It's a totally different paradigm. So I have to start there. So basically what I do is I'll start with an introduction, and we already assume they know what serverless is. So the introduction is now going to introduce specific areas of security, which in this case is service selection, so services. You'll have to forgive the turning back and forth. As a lefty, this is always tricky. Then code, so the code you write in a serverless application, as well as data flow. Right? So data flow, so how your data moves among these services. So these are the three main areas, and in the introduction, I'm going to go through them, why they're important, what aspects you need to look for, and really just level set so that the rest of the story makes sense to everybody. And of course, to wrap at the end of the intro, I'm going to introduce our architecture or our application. So people are going to know what we're hanging this whole story on. So level set, introduce the hero of our story, which is this application. Well, the hero is really you, the audience. Introduce the main thread of our talk, which is the application, and then get into it. So I'm going to start with that first pillar, which is services. Because this is an AWS conference, I only have to worry about AWS services here. That makes it easier. We're kind of all on the same playing ground. So I'm going to talk about things like AWS WAF and AWS Shield. I'm going to obviously talk about Lambda because that's the core of a lot of the custom code here. I'm going to talk about things like S3, like Dynamo. I'm going to talk about CloudWatch, absolutely critical for monitoring and evaluation, so not just CloudWatch metrics, but also CloudWatch events. And of course, it's reInvent. There's always some interesting surprises. So we'll see about what we talk here, depending on announcements. And that's really my first pillar. And again, I'm not just going to list each of these things saying, you should use Dynamo, and Dynamo has the following security information and configuration that you should be aware of. Nobody's going to sit around for that. There's too many good competing sessions at reInvent. So you got to make this interesting. You got to say, well, here's how we're going to do that initial defense. With WAF, we're going to keep attackers as far away from our data as possible, so that we can stop them as further as possible, give us more chances in case they get through. We're going to talk about, auto scaling in Dynamo, and doing that securely to make sure that we're not only meeting our needs of our users, but we're also meeting our security requirements. So we hang all of this around our servers, our services that we select to build our application, but we keep tying it back to that application so people get more and more invested in this story as it moves along. This is going to transition to our next piece, which is code. This is always tricky because there's a lot of human errors in here and a lot of challenges, but it's something we need to keep harping on. So we're going to talk about things like static analysis, so looking to make sure we're not making security vulnerabilities and bugs in our code. We're going to talk about quality control, quality assurance, building that into a serverless deployment pipeline. Now there's a lot of great talks, specifically serverless 329 with Ben Kehoe and Chris Munns, where they're actually building out an entire CI/CD pipeline. It's unfortunately at the same time as this talk, but both are great, I think. Both are well worth it. They're really important topics. We're going to touch on it a little bit here, just not super in depth, more around the security concerns of having that in place. And we're going to talk about dependencies, which doesn't sound like it's a really exciting thing, but it's a blind spot for most people when it comes to code. So this is our second pillar. And again, we're going to keep tying this back to the app. We're going to keep that story going. We're going to say, hey, we're building this cool app. Here's another piece of it. Here's another piece of it, because there's that investment there. That is going to lead us to our last pillar, and unfortunately it's the weakest pillar when it comes to serverless for right now. This is flow. It's our data flow between all of these different services. How does our data move? How do we track it? How are we aware of the security state of that data at any point in time? We're going to talk about things like AWS X-Ray. We're going to talk about manually logging. That's a big one. It's super boring, but I'll try to make it exciting and engaging. And again, this is why we tie it back to the app, because we can take a topic that's dry as all get out, like logging, and make sure that it's interesting, make sure that it's engaging for people. So we get that, and then that's going to lead to our wrap-up. Now, time-wise and pacing, this is a 60-minute slot, which means I'm trying to build out, realistically, a 50-minute talk. Because if I get a 50-minute talk, that means I get about 5 minutes of wiggle room as far as pacing. If I'm too fast, if there's something I want to go into in depth, or somebody asks a question on the fly, I can address it there. I'm not up against the hard stop. And I get another 5 minutes after that, 55 minutes to do Q&A. So I'll aim for a 50-minute talk that gives me 5 minutes of wiggle room and 5 minutes of Q&A. And if I'm spot on for 50 minutes, that means I get 10 minutes for Q&A. And there's always great questions at these kinds of conferences. The wrap-up, very much like your English teacher taught you in grade 9, you've introduced a thesis, you've had a couple main points, and then you have a bridging sentence into the rest of your essay here. We're doing the same thing. We're going to go back to these 3 points. We're going to highlight why service choice was so important. We're going to highlight why code was so important. We're going to talk about that data flow and end on a really high note. So for that normally means some sort of call to action. So maybe to come talk to me afterwards, or come visit me in the expo hall where I'll be at the Trend Micro booth, or at one of the other events. Or maybe it's, hey, go check out this repo on GitHub and you can see the code about what we talked about here. So there's some sort of high note to push that out, and that's really how I build out the talk. So now we've walked through each of these pillars. You see how that comes together. Hopefully that's really interesting. In the abstract, hopefully this particular talk, Serverless 308, is of interest to you. Please jump on the wait list. If you can't get a seat in the session, though remember there's 20% saved for walk-up room. But if you can't get a seat in the session, that's no problem. AWS publishes the talks a couple weeks after reInvent on their YouTube channel. And if you liked this video, by all means, leave a comment down below, or like the video, or if you have constructive criticism, leave that as well. And don't forget to subscribe. So subscribe to the YouTube channel, and you'll see more insider looks like this. Can't wait to see you in Vegas. Take care.